Okay. All right. So we're going to cover the history of Europe, and we're going to start from the time basically of the Messiah and just work our way up to almost the Protestant Reformation, that period of time, because that's the history most people don't know. And it's not that the historians don't know this, they just don't understand what the Father's doing during that time frame. Because the Messiah came, he picked out a group of people that he wanted to teach and spread the truth from that point, because he had to hit the reset button, because everything had just gotten all the teachings had just got out of control. And that's why he was trying to tell the Pharisees, look, the stuff you're teaching is just not correct. And so he was resetting things back up, and he actually began to work with a group of people that would begin to open up and start these churches. And so this is where this is where we start, and this is where Satan wanted completely to bring these people down. So it was and you will see this as I go through this, how he wanted to stamp out the true church. I mean, he really wanted to stamp out the true church and the people in the true church. And so, and he finally did make a big dent. And does everybody know when that happened? Does anybody know when that happened? The Dark Ages. That's one of the reasons they call it the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was when all religious teachings, other than the teaching of the Catholic Church in Europe, came to a screeching halt. Because they had to go underground then to be able to worship. And so this is that time period, and you're going to see this as we go through this. We'll start with Scythia first, and you know that most people do not realize that we have this war going on in the Ukraine, and they do not realize that the majority of the people in this country came from this area called Scythia. They came from that area, which is around that same area of the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And it's simple to see that. And the encyclopedia, I'm going to read what the Encyclopedia Britannica says. The main movement from Asia into Europe, which went north of the Caucasus, was at the early times that of the Scythians. So he's telling you the movement that went into Europe, which we call the Germanic tribes, that movement was the Scythians, and we know where the Scythians lived. Okay, so we can back up just a tiny bit and just hit another reference, and that is the reference of Josephus that says the tribes of Israel are just immense, and they're just across the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates River on the other side would have been Parthia. Now, the man that the historian Jordanus, he wrote about the Goths in Rome, and we're going to talk quite a bit about the Goths because that's one of the names. It was actually, it means God. And so it says his work was Gita, which is another name for them, an existing history of the Gothic people today. Claim, and then let's just read this. The Goths and some of the kindred peoples united into one body, first wandering through the western Russia. Then they went to the Black Sea, the Sea of Azor, and spread themselves westerly toward the Blue Danube. So he was the one that really identified that these people that were the Goths lived around the Black Sea. So this is where Scythia was, and the Parthia was underneath it. And eventually, and you can see, I'm just showing you the map. This is the Sarmatians right here. This is the tribe that pushed out, they pushed the Israelites out, the Scythians out of this area, and they were then had no place to go. They had to go into Rome. And so you see over here the Sacae, you see the Mesogeti. These would have been normal tribes that you see, the Baraka. You could see some of these normal tribes, or Armenia. These were all Israelite tribes in here. All of this was Israelite tribes. So around 424, Parthia would fall to Persia. And the Persians are not like the Persians today, which really puzzles me, because the Persians at that time were just it was amazing. They just allowed all people to believe whatever they wanted to believe. They just left them alone. When they came into that area, which was Parthia, a lot of believers were in that area. They just left them alone. They didn't interfere with their religion. And so today that would not happen in the land of Iran. I can tell you that right now. So it's just such a paradox to me. But around that same time, the White Huns, which would be what tribe? Somebody tell me.
Nefertali. Nefertali.
Naphtali. All right. So
Because, yeah.
yeah. So they would have been the tribe that went into, some of the tribes went into Asia, but this was one of the main tribes that went into Asia. I think they were called the Kasti. And they signed a peace treaty about the same time. Around the same time they signed this peace treaty. And so the Scythians lost power in that region began around the second and third century. All right, so around the second and third century, the Scythians started being pushed out of that region, and they had no other place to go except to Rome. And so when Parthia fell, that was a really big deal because now they started moving themselves toward the Blue Danube River. And Valens was the emperor of Rome at that time, and he knew these people were warlike people because Parthia had fought Rome 13 times and never defeated them. Because Rome was trying to push their way eastward, and they were really land bound, and they had to push through Parthia, and they never were able to do that. And that's very interesting because history leaves all of that out. They leave all of that out. They don't ever talk about any of that when it comes to the Roman Empire. And even Caesar, the day that he died, was the March the 15th, which was the Ides of March, which is a really interesting date because that's also the same date they officially just shut down everybody in America when the COVID outbreak came. So that was the shutdown date, was the 15th of March, which I think is so interesting, such an interesting date. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, these people began to push their way into the Roman Empire, and Valens allowed them to come in as mercenaries. Now, they separated them in a camp area, and what happened basically is they were giving them food, but the food that they were giving them, people were stealing it before it got to them, and so they were starving. And so they didn't have any way to defend themselves because they didn't have any guns or weapons. And that's when the father raised up Erlich. And he was very interesting. They kept calling him the Moses of their time. And he led the people in a battle. And the first city he went to was I think it's called Arianople. And so Arianople, these men fought the people in Arianople with no weapons and defeated them. Now, that's powerful people. Do you understand that they were warlike people? Yes, but they were powerful people. Because to fight without weapons is just, I can't imagine. But it got to the point where they had no other choice but to fight and take some of these cities. Now, then when they sacked that city, they began their migration and pushing their way in. And they'd never done that. I don't think they'd ever done that in their history before. And this whole period of time was called the Great Wandering. So, Dan, do you want to make any comments?
Just about Parthia. Actually, they were Scythians. They came down and after Alexander the Great defeated the Persians. His empire only lasted 90 years before the Scythians, the Massagetae, and the other tribes on the eastern part of the Caspian Sea came down and took over and created Parthia. So that's why they were known as brother nations, the Scythians and Parthians, because they were actually Scythians. And in the the Iranian Chamber of Commerce, they said that the Romans called the Parthians Germani, double I at the back of Germany. They were
Yes.
called. There's a lot of Germanic names in Iran today.
Yeah. Yes. When they wrote the history of the Scythians, they kept mentioning that they were cousins or brothers or
Yeah,
kinsmen. They kept saying kinsmen.
kinsmen.
Yes.
Yeah, because they were Scythians.
Yes.
Yes.
So, all right, we're going to start with Natali, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about him. His name means to wrestle. His symbol was the deer, and he was the white hunts. In history, they called him the Naphalites. Sometimes you hear him referred to as the Happalites, but he had many names. Now, this was a very powerful tribe. Okay, very powerful. That's why the Chinese built the Great Wall, was to keep them out, because they went in there originally for a gold rush. And so interesting. And we talked about that already. They would move up into the area of Norway around the 5th century, right before the Vikings began their raids. And the scripture talks about them. It says that they are like a hind let loose, and they give goodly words. So they're kind of like, their strength would be in writing, so their strength would be in writing. But all of these tribes, as we go through them, you will see how unbelievably powerful they are.
They when they signed that peace treaty with China in 216 A.D., they kind of hung around Mongolia where they actually lived, and then they ended up moving west. That's how they ended up in Europe. But some of them went into India, and they had a Hephalite, same name, Nephalite empire in India, and they ended up
Oh,
mixing with the Indians. That's how you got the caste system. People don't realize that.
wow. No, I didn't know that. Okay, so these are the names of the tribes. These are the Germanic tribes, and we'll be talking about most of them as we go through. You can see them here. We're going to be talking about all of them as we go through. I want to start here with as they came in. They they the Romans and the Greeks wrote the history. Okay, they wrote the history. They hated these people, and they called them barbarians. They called them pagans, but they were not. They were already Christianized before they actually came into Europe. So you had three different bodies of believers in the Roman Empire. Now you had the group that were coming in, which was the Germanic tribes. They were called the Aryans, and they took their name. That's because they were given that name by the Romans. They were called the Aryans because of their leader. The leader was named Arian. We'll talk about him. And interesting, because they were keeping Saturday, Sabbath, and the holy days. We can see this as this thing rolls in. And then the Catholic Church was forming at that time, which the emperors at that point were leaning away from some of the paganism. Okay, so they were leaning away from paganism at that time, and they were trying to establish a church that both groups could worship together, because you had the pagans there that were Sunday keepers, and then you had the Roman Catholic Church that was just beginning to form around that time. And they were trying to merge these two groups so they would keep them from fighting. They actually put a law in place saying that they were heretics, and that you could not marry, the Romans would not be allowed to marry among the Arians. Okay, so interesting. And so here's the history right here. Even the Wikipedia comes back and tells you that they were already Christianized, were still outside the boundaries of the empire. They converted to Arianism rather than the Orthodox Catholicism, and was soon regarded as heretics. See, they know the history. They know the history. And so this is how they came in. They just wanted to come in, have homes, and raise their families and form. That's all they wanted to do, because these were formers. Now, they had their own Bible. It was called the Atala, and it was their prized possession. I'm going to read you a little bit about the history. It became known as the Atala. Euphilus, who we're going to talk about, wrote the Gothic Bible from the received text of Lucian. So Lucian around second, I'm not sure when he actually lives, around the second, third century, took all the New Testament and put it together. And he was in Antioch, and they hated him so bad in that area. He did establish a church and a school there, but they took him and put him in prison, and he starved to death. That's a terrible way to die. So you know that this would be the text that Erasmus would use. Now, Erasmus is the one that actually published the first Bible on the printing press. And he took this Bible and published it. This Bible, the Gothic Bible, and he published it. Okay, so it was really interesting. This is not the same Bible as the Latin Vulgate, which was created by Jerome in the 4th century. So you had two different Bibles. Now you had other Bibles being created, and they were being created out of Egypt by basically at the Philo school. So you had two or three, the Sinaiticus, several other Bibles being created. They had they really had a Greek slant to them. So it's interesting. This is how we received our Bible. I think that's very interesting. And they already had it when they went into the Roman Empire. Now, we're going to talk about the persecution. You know about the persecution with Nero, how terrible that was, but he was an insane man. But I'm going to read you about some of the persecution that went on. In the spring of 303, a serious persecution against the Christians in Rome. About 3,000 were tortured, imprisoned, and dislocated. And Maximus, he reigned in the western side of the Roman Empire, and Diocletian reigned in the eastern side. The persecution was coming from Diocletian. And he was the one that was really pushing this persecution. And so then we had at least one episode that was in Egypt around 311, where there was 144,000 Egyptian Christians that died. They killed them. And so interesting, because Galerius, which was the stepson of Diocletian, Galerius, really interesting, the ones that he burned down a palace and he blamed it on the Christians. But God took a very strong hand here. And so Galerius got extremely ill, very ill, and he realized when he became ill that it was because he had persecuted the Christians. So he put an edict in. It was called the Nicene Decree, and that decree was the one that he pushed in, and it gave everybody religious freedom at that time in the Roman Empire. Very interesting. Now, then you would have coming behind him Constantine, because everybody knows about him, but they don't ever have the right story on him. And so he was pushing Sunday. We know that. He was pushing Sunday. And he established the Council of Nicaea because he was trying again to stop the quarrels between the pagans and the Christians. So what he did is that he set up this Council of Nicaea. All the church leaders were told to come. And if they didn't agree to sign off on it, that they were to be exiled from the land. Well, this is Arius. See, this is how they got their name, because Arius was their leader. Arius was the leader in that time frame, and he was opposed to signing off on this decree, the Nicene Decree. So they politely exiled him out of the kingdom. So they said that he actually rode into the building on his white horse. Now, I don't know if that's really true, but that's what history says. And so the edict that he pushed in, he also pushed in, Constantine pushed in an edict, and it was called the Edict of Milan. And every person had the right to practice religion that they wanted. And that was basically true, but he just could not help but try to push people toward the Sunday worship. But there's more to that story. He caused such a stir that he feared for his life, and he fled from Rome and went into Constantinople. And so when he went to Constantinople, he is established the Roman Empire in Constantinople at that point. So interesting that the 321 AD, the Council of Nicaea, Constantine forbid work on Sunday. And of course, the Seventh-day believers and the Jews, they certainly didn't like that. But he did not force it or stop them from keeping the Saturday Sabbath. Okay. Now, Athanaeus was the man who actually led the council. He was educated in the Philo school. This is the same school that had Clement and Origen in it. And this was the ones that were pushing all the teachings that you see now that are in the Catholic Church. And this is all the followers were called Ante-Nicene Fathers. Now, so this is basically some of the history around some of this, so you can see how this was coming down. And of course, many of the people fled from that area, began to flee because, they saw the handwriting on the wall, right? Now, interesting that Constantine had 3 sons. He divided the empire between his 3 sons. And Constantius was the one that just came in and took control over all the regions. He just took the other regions away from his brothers. And at that point, that's when the father brought in a religious leader, and his name was Euphilus. Euphilus was his name. He was a slave's son. I mean, he was the low of the low. And I think it was actually even the Goths that put him in slavery, his family in slavery, if I'm not mistaken. So you kind of see the father's hand, how he picks people. He picks the humble people. And so this man rode in and caused this huge, huge revival in that area. I mean, huge revival. We're going to talk about it. And it was so big that Constantius became an Arian Christian. Now, that's just amazing to me. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, so they began at that point to start tearing down the temples and banning pagan ritual sacrifices. I mean, they were really stomping out paganism in Rome at this point in time. And so it's so interesting because even, I was talking about Euphilus. Even at this time, I think he was the one that actually wrote the Gothic Bible, which we call the Itala Bible now. And he was finishing up his work at the same time Patrick was beginning his. So Patrick, St. Patrick, they call him in Ireland, was beginning to start his work because it caused this huge revival. And Felix II, now picture this. So many people were converting to Arianism that the Pope converted. He was called the anti-Pope in history. His name is Felix II. He's called the anti-Pope. He reigned in that time. I just think that's so unbelievably funny. At the same time that's going on, the Catholic Church put a decree in. And I think their Pope was Damascus at that point. But he's not the one that put the decree in. The decree came in before him. And that is the decree of Elvira. So in the Council of Elvira, it states this: in order to correct the enormous practice, it is decided that we must celebrate a vigorous fast every Saturday. So this is how the Catholics tried to resolve the issue. They said, you're going to fast, you can stay in the Roman Empire, but you have to fast on Saturday. And so that, because they were pushing Sunday worship. And so, but they required the people to fast on Saturday. And this went on for centuries that they were required to fast. But it was done by the Council of Elvira. It's easy to remember that because that name is so distinct, right? Now, this is the man that caused the greatest, Diodorus. He was the one that caused the greatest persecution of the Christians around that time frame. He came in later. This is where we get a Christmas becoming a holiday. It came in under Theodosius. and he wrote that everybody that wasn't Catholic Christians were demented and insane. We order that they bear the infamy of heresy. So he called them all heretics. And so these would be the people that were in that empire at that time, would be the Visigoths. Now, then you had the Ambrose, which was you remember there's a stronghold in Milan, okay? That there was a stronghold of Christians, and they began destroying all the temples and shrines. So it didn't take long before all of that was destroyed. Now you're beginning to have some of these Roman emperors step up and really cause huge persecutions, which we're going to talk about the next one. All right, so about that time, it seems funny that every time there's a revival, then there's a major war that follows right after that. So in 410, the Goths, which was the tribes that I told you about, that were the Germanic tribes that were coming in, they were beginning toppling cities in Rome. They finally got to Rome and they sacked it in 410. The Goths sacked it. And their general, I think they murdered over 30,000 Germanic soldiers. And that resulted in Alaric declaring war on them. And they tried to get Honorius, who was the king of Rome at that time, the emperor of Rome, and they tried to get him to surrender, but he refused. So they went in, surrounded him, and took him down, and they sacked the city. Now, they didn't. They said they did it gently. The history that comes back said that they came in very gently. They only really sacked the wealthy homes. The poor residents they left alone. Okay. And I want to stop here and talk about the Visigoths, because that's the tribe that came in. They were the tribe of Gad, but they weren't by themselves. There was many tribes that went with them, but they were the lead tribe, and their name means troop comes. Now, in Genesis 49:19, it talks about and gives you the history. Gad, a troop called, shall overcome him, but he shall overcome them at last. So, that is written referencing Gad, a troop overcame him. That would have been the Persians, but then he would overcome at last is when he took down the Roman Empire. So he would lead this. That would be the German people today. They would push themselves down into Spain, and then eventually they would move over into the area of Germany. Very interesting history for them, because Gad was also one of the tribes anciently that lived in Spain. It was like the Visigoths got to go back to their homeland. So the Goths controlled who came out of the area of the Mediterranean Sea. They controlled that. And so they were the ones that said the land was flat, and if you go too far, you'll fall off. That came from them. They were the ones that taught that. And so they kept people from venturing out, especially to America, where many of them went. And, they knew about it. Aristotle wrote about America. And he said there's this place that has all these rivers and mountains and a big plain area. He was describing it. He said it's way past, it's far out there, but we've never seen it. And so he heard about it. He knew about it, but the Goths were the ones that prevented the people from going out through the area around what they call the Pillar of Hercules, which was Gibraltar, right? So, they, like I said before, I want to mention one thing here. They finally took down their enemy, and Rome was established by the Edomites. I don't have time to prove it in this session. I proved it in other history sessions. But they took down their enemy after 400, 500 years of being at war with them. They lost, the Romans lost the battle to Parthia, we've mentioned 13 times. They finally were able to take down their enemy in 410. Now, at that same time, the people who were in the area of the Scandinavian countries began to push their way back into the continent. They came in as the Anglo-Saxon people, and they would push their way in at that point into Britain, because when the war started with the Visigoths, the Roman emperor called for the troops that were in England to come back home to help with the war. Now they moved into the Visigoths themselves. There were two tribes of Goths. One was called the Visigoths. They moved into Spain. And then you had another group that was called the Ostrogoths. They were in northern Italy. And then you had another group called the Vandals. It's like there was three major groups of Israelite nations combining. The Vandals would move into North Africa. So they really had pretty much taken over the Roman Empire. Do y'all see that? Now, they began to backslide, and that's basically when they began to make some changes in their faith. Because when you start compromising, this is what happens. So in 496, Clovis, who was the king of the Franks. Now, Franks are Reuben. Those are the French. That early history, their very first Frank leader, his name was Maverick, was his name. And they rushed him out of the kingdom, sent him back to Germany because he was great at battles, but he wanted to take everybody's wife. So they sent him back to Germany. They couldn't run the kingdom without him, so they brought him back. And so you can kind of see that history with them. This king, Clovis, he married Clotilda, who was the daughter of the king of the Burgundians. The Burgundians would have been the tribe of Asher. They were devoted to the Catholic faith, and they professed the faith in 496. So because he married this woman, and she talked him into establishing the Roman Catholic Church as the dominant church for the Goths in Spain. Big mistake. And so he let a woman talk him into something that he shouldn't have done. And so, he baptized like 3,000 men. He must have really loved this woman. You could see that it was not going to go well from that point on with them. So you're down to the 5th century here, and they've already converted to the Roman faith. They've already converted to Catholicism. Because of this man wants to please his wife. I mean, you won't see this. You're going to see this through history all the time. That, the woman has this kind of influence to influence her husband to do these wicked things. So, so going on, just to mention a little bit more about Clovis, many of the Christians fled out from under the reign of Clovis to Italy. And because there was a king there called Theodoric the Great. Now, Theodoric the Great was an Ostrogoth. He would have been in the northern, you had the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. He would have been in northern Italy. And he expelled Odoacer, who was the emperor that came in and took down very last Roman emperor. He's Odysseus, and so he expelled him from the kingdom, but he actually had taken down the last Roman emperor. Then that would form the Byzantine Empire, and the very first king would be Zippo's son, and then eventually he would also reign. And I'm not going to get into that history. He is an Edomite, and we can prove that in another time. So now the Byzantine Empire is being developed under the role of the Edomites. Okay, so of course they were under the role of the Edomites in the very beginning in the Roman Empire also. So we're noticing here there was a separation between the Aryan Ostrogoths and the Roman population. Theodoric stressed the importance of racial harmony, seeking to restore the glory of the ancient Rome. He ruled Italy in a more peaceful and prosperous period until his death in 526. Now, it's interesting because now these people now have a place to go. Do y'all understand? Now they can move out of the kingdom, which was in Spain, that was now turning Catholic, and they had a place that they can go to. Do y'all see that? And so the father's setting up, just like he's going to always do, for provide a place of protection for his people. All right, so we want to talk about the main tribe, one of the main tribes that's in northern Italy, and that was the Lombards. They were the most unbelievably fierce tribe. The Romans hired the Lombards to take down a group of people called the Ghibellines. And they were so brutal that the Romans said, we don't want to have nothing to do with you anymore. You're done. This man, Elbowan, who was their leader, he was the leader of the Lombards. I'm going to take a little time and talk about him. He killed the king, cut his head off, and his wife was named Rosanna, and he took her for a wife. This was the daughter of the king of the Ghibellines. So he took her for his queen. He had the head of her father brought to the table while they were eating. I mean, this is how cruel some of these people were. And she absolutely flipped out. And from that point, she was planning her escape. And she was going to take everything she could while she was planning her escape. So, that's how that basically came down. They would be taken down. The Lombards would be taken down by Charlemagne later on in history. So interesting, because it says Simeon and Levi both were brothers. Instruments of cruelty was their habitation. That's, you can see it. You really can see it. Now, that's why you see in Europe, the people in Northern Europe, many of them are blonde, blue-eyed, and the ones in the bottom of Italy, I'm not Europe, I meant Italy, the bottom of Italy have the dark eyes and the dark hair. Dark hair and dark eyes, indication that, not always, but that they're not of the tribes of Israel. All right, so cursed be your anger, your fierceness, your wrath, for it is your cruelty. I will divide you in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So they were not to get an inheritance. And you could see that this happened because Charlemagne went and took their empire, you see. But he really basically, when he came along, all of Europe was underneath him at that juncture, really. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about Reuben. His symbol was the water lily. He was the firstborn. He was known for his strength, his dignity, and his excellency of power. That was his strength. He really dominates Europe even today. He's the dominant power. He's the one that brought the weakness. He's unstable as water. He went to his father's bed. That's when he slept with one of his father's wives. This was, a characteristic that especially some of the French rulers would have. Okay, they're kind of womanizers. Okay, I'm not saying everybody is. I'm just saying, some of the ones that were ruling. Now we come to Justinian. This is where the major persecution comes. Theodorus pushed in the holidays. Remember that Theodorus was the emperor that pushed in the pagan holidays. But it was Justinian that really caused the great persecution. We're going to go over that. Now, Justinian reigned about 521. He actually went in and reconquered all the territories. Like North Africa, he pushed the Vandals out of there. He began to take back the lands that had been established by the Germanic tribes and put them under his rulership now. He was declared head of the Holy Roman Church, which was the Catholic Church. That was the faith that they had. Now, he gave the people 3 months to profess Catholic faith, and if they didn't, they would lose their citizenship, they would lose their employment, their estates would be seized. That's really when things got very serious for the believers, and they began now to push themselves into the east, because the eastern area, remember, was established by the Persians, and the Persians allowed religious freedom. So you see this going on. So interesting, because they pushed all of these people and began to push them in this flight toward the east that were believers. I want to talk about him in particular because this angered the Heavenly Father. And you're fixing to see what I'm saying here. Okay, it angered the Father, and this is what happened. The bubonic plague started right here under Justinian. It hit the Byzantine Empire, which is what we're talking about here. It struck the capital, which is Constantinople, where Justinian resided. It was recorded that 10,000 people a day died. They think that as much as 25 million people across the world died from this particular plague. The Father was hot. He was hot. And so it's not by accident that Justinian is pushing all the Christians out of the area, out of their homes. They're losing their homes. They're having to go eastward. It wasn't so much that just happened by accident, that the bubonic plague started at the same time. No, it's not by accident. It's not by accident at all. The Father really dropped the hammer here. Because I want to talk about two other tribes. One is Asher. The reason I want to talk about Asher is because they got pushed out of, they were the main tribe of the Vandals. They were one of the main tribes. They are Belgium today. Their symbol is a cup. You can see it right here because it holds oil. It talks about, they were the Ligenians and the Burgundians, which we talked about. Let Asher be blessed with children. Let them be acceptable to his brother. Let him dip his foot in oil. And then it says, Asher, his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal delicacies. So you can see that this is true because Belgium, you hear about Belgian waffles, many sweet rolls, all of these things come out of Belgium. So interesting but at that point, they lived in northern Africa, not too far from the old land of Israel. You see, they were living in that same area. Today, you see this on the Galatia, which is the area that's in the top of Spain. You will see this cup symbol. So you had to have some of these people move into that area also in little pockets. So that's Asher. Now we want to talk about Issachar. He was the donkey. He would have been with the Vandals. In real life, he plays the role of the Swiss people and the Finns. These are the two tribes that really don't mix their tribes among other tribes. They basically stay in the same tribe. In fact, Finland has almost nobody in it that's not Finns. It's strange, isn't it? But that's what it is. Now, Issachar, it's interesting because they were said that they understood the times. They would have been people that were very intellectual. They were a people that studied prophecy. They would have studied the calendar also. And so they would be described in Genesis as a strong ass couching between two burdens. And that's basically where they've been, because they are a neutral country. They try to stay out of the wars. They would have been from between Germany and France because they were always at war. So you can actually see that. And you can see the Finns are kind of in between the European tribes and Russia. So it kind of fits. They also have this symbol. They have the donkey as their symbol. But they also have stars because they had something to do with the calendar. But, I don't know exactly what. Now,
Linda?
yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so they are the tribe of Issachar. So when they left the Middle East, they end up in a place in Russia called Tuva, which is in eastern Kazakhstan or western Mongolia, the Altai Mountains, okay?
Yeah.
And they were called Isidones. So if you're an Issachar, you'd be an Isidone, would you not?
Yes, I guess so.
So from there, when they moved west to Finland, because them and the Hungarians were the last tribes to arrive in Europe, and they speak a different language called the Altai family language. But when they got into Finland, they divided into 4 areas of Finland, and one was the name of each son of Issachar.
Yes.
That's in the ancient maps.
Yes, it
So
is
they've
true.
they've got the most proof that they is Issachar.
Yes. So interesting. But they would be the people that in history, I remember that in the book of Judges, they would call the tribe of Issachar up to counsel with them. They were the more intellectual tribe. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we get to the next prophet that comes in, and that's Columbus. And he was sent to Europe. His mother had a dream about him. This was during Justinian's reign, by the way, that he came to power as a huge player in starting another revival. But his mother had a dream while she was carrying him, that there was a great light came down on her stomach. And I just think that's interesting. And so he was described as being very tall and very handsome. He studied in Bandor. Now, Bandor was a college, it would be like Harvard today, where they would send all the children that were very gifted and talented to this Bandor school. It was a Celtic school, and it was in Wales. It was ran by the Levites. Some of the Levites went into the area of Wales. And so interesting, because this is where he was educated. This is a very important in history, because one of the Celtic leaders, I think he's from the county of Sextus, I think was the county that he was from. He went in and he just slaughtered all the children. It was a terrible, terrible event in history, where he just went in and slaughtered all the children in this school. And he was a pagan Celtic leader. The Catholic Church called him the Antichrist. But he led this huge revival at that time. Now, this is about the same time Justinian is coming out, and now we have coming in, we have Charles Martel. Now, everybody knows who Charles Martel is, because he was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And he was the one that, as the Muslims began to push their way into Spain, you see, because now the Moors who live in North Africa began to start pushing their way into Spain. The Moors would be Moab and Ammon. So you basically had, in the southern part of Spain, you would have Moab, and below them is Portugal. That would be the area for Ammon. Those were the 2 brothers. You remember those Lot's children, and they always lived at the bottom of Israel. But it would be Charles Martel that kept them from going into Spain. They were basically kept in the bottom of Spain. Now, the Spanish conquistadors would come out of that area. The battle was in 732, and he was able to push back the Moors from coming into the area of Europe. But this man right here led this huge revival. You never heard of him. Nobody ever talks about him in history. But this whole thing was always about people's faith. I mean, it was always about people's faith, and nobody in the historians today don't cover it, because they don't think that way. You understand, they don't think that way. Now I'm going to talk about Levi, but the Levites would move out into Wales. And so you see that a lot of the Welsh that came into our land were probably the Levites. All right, so it says that it wants to talk about Levites. It's the same thing. They were divided among Jacob and scattered among Israel, because they were such a cruel group. Now they had redeeming factors. Their symbol would be, and they would be the high priest and the priest in the temple, right? Their symbol would be the breastplate of the high priest. Okay. Now, Charlemagne, again, he was the grandson of Charles Martel. He was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, where did that come from? Now we know that there was a crown that was believed to be from Nimrod that was passed all the way down to Pergamus. And even some of the Christian churches teach this history, that it was passed down. But when they got to Granian, everybody was, Caesar couldn't wear it because he died before he could wear it. So his nephew, which was Augustus, right? He wore it. He was the first one to wear it. And the title is the Holy Roman Emperor. That's what the title is. And so interesting, because Granian refused to wear it because for real smart on his part, right? And he passed it to the Pope at that time, which was Pope Damascus. That would have been around the 3rd century because Pope Damascus lived at that time. So you can see the history here. I'm not going to go through it. I'm going to save these files for y'all. And so Charlemagne began to really work to bring all of the land of the European countries under his control, and he did it. Okay. Justinian had done most of it, but he did it. He brought them under his control. And interesting, he led an army into the area of Norway and Sweden, and they killed 5,000 Saxon noblemen. And this would cause the Viking raid. So the Vikings just went ape because he went in and chopped down their holy tree, which was like a pillar for them, statue or something. And they went in and chopped it down. And this just outraged the people that were the Vikings. So around that 7th century and the 8th century, you would see the Viking raid starting, and they would raid into the Catholic Church all up and down the coastlines. So eventually these are the people we call the Vikings. They would be the tribe of Benjamin. I'm going to do a separate teaching just on Benjamin, but I want to mention that these were the people that stopped Attila the Hun. I mean, so many of these, it really, they were the ones that also went down and settled into the area around Kiev, which was around the area of the Ukraine, around the 10th century. There's a lot of history on them, but they were a fierce tribe. Even in Israel went to war with Benjamin 3 times before they were able to defeat him. These are powerful people. And these are, our ancestors were extremely warlike, and extremely physically strong. And so you just didn't want to come up against them. And this is an example of it. Now, eventually, they tried to push their way into England, but they were stopped by Alfred the Great. So Alfred the Great was the king of Britain at that time period, and he claimed that he was the 10th descendant from Joseph of Arimathea, which I think is so interesting. We're going to talk about Alfred. He's amazing. He's amazing. So they stopped. The Vikings were stopped. They were not allowed to come into Britain. So they basically settled. They went in and settled in the low lands in Scotland. Interesting. So by 1000 BC, some of the Vikings settled in North France, and that would be the Normans. Remember the Normans? And that whole area is called Normandy. If you remember, they took that area. They was hitting so much land that the French just said, here, we're going to carve you out a spot and you can go there. So this would be Benjamin. He's called the son of my right hand. He resides basically in Norway. His symbol is the wolf. You can see this on some of the symbols that they have national symbols for. He will devour prey, and at night he will divide the spoil. This is talking about a fierce bunch of people. Okay, a fierce bunch of people. But the one that the Father says he never compromises. When you go to Jeremiah chapter 6, it refers to our people who are the Christians as Benjamin, because we are not going to bend our back to this government that's about take place that's coming down, which is going to be ran by the beast power. And so that's why we're called Benjamin. We're not going to bend. Now, St. Patrick's. St. Patrick's, I'm going to tell you his history. Again, he came in. I was trying to remember the time frame. He came in right around the time, I think the 4th century. He left home. He thought he knew more than his parents, around 16 years old. And they talked him into going on this boat. And he got, before he knew it, he had been confiscated as a slave. And they brought him to Ireland as a slave. And he was a pig farmer. So he did that for 7 years. And then the father sent him a dream. And so he followed the instructions in the dream. He followed the instructions that said, go to this ship and you can go home. So he went to the shore. He found the ship. He walked on the ship. They said nobody even questioned why he was there. He walked on the ship and it took him back home. And so interesting that he stayed there until he had another dream from the father that told him to go back to Ireland. And he's the one that set up 250 churches. He also wrote a book called Lege Moshe, which was, he had copied like 4 or 5 books out of the Bible and put them in every church so they would have books. Okay, interesting. But this, we know from history that he kept the Saturday Sabbath and he kept the holy days. Although the Catholics claim that he was a Catholic, they know in history that he wasn't. All right, that would be the tribe of Dan, the Irish people. The symbol with Dan, he was not able to establish really well in the land of Israel. The Philistines kept taking his land. He wound up in Greece. He fought in the war against the Trojans, helped take down the Trojan in the Trojan War. He was exiled from Greece and he went into the bottom part of Ireland. He settled himself into the area of the bottom part of Ireland. And he's there today. I mean, he's still there. His symbol was a white horse and an eagle. And it says that he would bite the heels of the horse and the rider would fall backwards. And then in Judges, it also says that, Dan, why are you still remaining in ships? So it's interesting because he is the Irish people. He is the Irish people today. I always think about this because their song is Danny Boy. They don't understand why they sing Danny Boy, but that's because they come from the tribe of Dan. Now, it's interesting when he was in Greece because that's where we get all these stories about Hercules, and you would have had some of that influence also because it was Samson, if you remember, that actually was the one that was such a fierce warrior in the Bible, and he was from the tribe of Dan. And the tribe means to judge because a lot of times you see him either as in the law or you find the tribe of Dan, the Irish people, in the police departments. So they're involved in the law. Dan, do you want to say anything?
Yes, just to prove what you just said is before the Exodus in Egypt, the 4 ancient writers wrote of people coming from Egypt to Greece, to Crete, then to Greece. And if you look at ancient maps, it was called Danann. And that's the same name as the tribe that they described that came to Ireland after the tribe of Dan, Talaeth Dan or something it's called. So yeah, you just fall back up what you said. Actually, it's recorded in history about the movement of the tribe of Dan.
Yes. You would have had some of the people also coming out of Egypt around that time that Moses was in Egypt. And those people would have gone also to that area that we're talking about, which is Ireland, but they settled in the top of Ireland. They would eventually become part of Northern Ireland. That tribe is a tribe of Judah. That is a tribe of Judah. And this is one of the reasons why they brought the stone. Remember, they brought the stone the history is that Jeremiah brought that stone to Ireland, Jacob's stone. He brought that stone to Ireland. And so that stone would be taken into Scotland later on. But interesting, because there was a tribe of Judah in the top of Ireland, and that history comes from Geoffrey Keating, who wrote the history of the Irish people. That they sat at the top of Northern Ireland, which is one of the most fierce places, because remember you had Northern Ireland. Those people lived at the top up there. They were always at war with England. Always, they were always fighting with England, the Northern Ireland.
Linda,
Yes,
here when I did my research on Ireland and the tribe of Dan and Judah, almost one over half the counties of Ireland have the red line of Zerah. So that means that the tribe of Judah was there governing.
yeah,
And the
well,
county is so many places in Ireland that have either the stone or the red line of Zerah in their flags and incorporated in their coat of arms, and
yes,
drawings of kings of Ireland with the red line of Zerah.
yes. So interesting because they would move themselves into Scotland eventually, at the very top of Scotland, which is where the Highlanders are. The Highlanders lived in the mountain region in Scotland. They would have been the people that were in Northern Ireland. So interesting. It's just very interesting because people don't make that connection. But the Irish history is there. See, it's just that people are not making those connections. And so that's how you know who comes to America and who they are, because a lot of the people from Scotland would start migrating into America, into the South. And that's why I teach people that a lot of the people in the South originally was from the tribe of Judah. And that's because the people that we're talking about that lived at the top of Northern Ireland moved themselves into Scotland. And y'all know the story of Robert the Bruce. You know these stories. They had the Stone of Scots with them at that time. And if it would be Edward, King Edward of Britain, that would go in and take that stone. If you remember that history, why would they be fighting over a stone? You see, because they knew that was a sacred stone that the Israelites had kept for all those years, and Judah kept that stone. So I mean, interesting stuff. It's just nobody makes those connections because they're not looking at what was the thread all through history. Now Zebulon, their symbol was a ship. You can see it on their seal in 1579. You can see the seal. They were the people called the Frisians. They came into the area of the Netherlands at a very early age. I think they were there probably before the Franks came in to the area of Gaul. These would be the tribe of Zebulon. It means to come to dwell. They would live along the sea. They were havens, were in ships. They were merchants. Okay, they were merchants. They would go out to sea. They did a lot of trading later on in the areas of America, but also into Africa, and especially Southern Africa. It says they would suck the treasure abundance from the sea and treasures hid in the sand. That would be diamond. And Deuteronomy 33:18. And Zebulun said, rejoice, Zebulun, in going in and out, and Issachar in her tents. These two tribes typically tried to stay together. Do y'all see that? All right, so then we had Zebulon that says he handles the pen. He was a writer. The reason they say that is this is the Dutch people. The Dutch people were the ones that brought us the printing press. So yeah, they handled the pen. That's for sure. And so they brought us the printing press. It's interesting how all of this lines up in their history. And they were the merchants. They would go in and settle in really in New York eventually. All right, now we're finally getting to the English part. And this is going to go pretty quickly now because, Joseph of Arimathea is believed to have come to the area of Glastonbury. And so there was a cardinal named Baronius who actually was in charge of the Vatican Library, and he found documents. And one of the things he found, it says Joseph and many disciples traveled the Holy Land and landed in Marseilles. And then it says that he went to Gaul 360, 336 AD. And Joseph went to England and established seminaries and started missionaries. See, that's written in the Catholic Church history. They have those documents. Okay, and there's more. There's other people that wrote the same thing. There was a monk called Gladius that wrote the same thing. And they're talking about how Joseph of Arimathea came in. They know he came into Britain. Now, Joseph, his symbol would be the bull. The Anglo-Saxon word angles means bull. It says he's the firstling of the bulls, and his horn is like the horn of a unicorn. And for them, he pushed the people toward the ends of the earth. And so then it goes to say 10,000s of Ephraim and thousands of Manasseh. And so this was their symbol. You can see here's Britain, coat of arms, and you can see that you have the symbol of the lion on here also, and the unicorn. Do y'all see the unicorn? This would be Joseph. And so the Anglo-Saxon people, remember, would move into Britain. They came out of the Scandinavian countries. They moved into Britain. They were actually brought there by King Odin in the 1st century. Now, the Celtic Church, when St. Augustine came, he wrote back to, and he came as he was a monk. And so that's how they introduced the Catholic Church into Britain, is through him. But he said something very interesting. He wrote a document back to the Pope, and he said, I saw the house that the Messiah built with his own 2 hands. So they knew that the Messiah had been there. He said, I saw the house. It was still standing at this point. It was still standing I just think it's amazing. So, I'm going to read you some of this. We have known that early Britain, from the followers of the Bible before St. Augustine entered into Britain, Gallius, Beda, and even Caesar wrote about the Celtic people memorized the Bible. And it says they wrote about the Druids, and it said that they were pupils having to memorize large numbers of verses, as many as some spent 20 years in their studies. So these were not pagan people. They, and we believe that Mary went there also, and there's a church there that they feel like, where she's buried, and it's called St. Mary's Church. Of course, that's a whole story by itself, because, there's hardly anything left of the remains of that now. But I mean, there's more history on that. But
yes, I just want to back up that story that the Druids wrote down that for 1,000 years, people all over Britain and came from continental Europe came to Glastonbury to see the house that Jesus built. For 1,000 years, people would pilgrim to Glastonbury to see that house that he built, that cottage. You never hear that in our written books.
Yes, they did. They came to that area because many people, there was a graveyard there, and many people wanted to be buried there. Many kings and well, I think were buried in that area also.
Well, that's right, because for when Joseph Arimathea went there and started baptizing everybody and putting on the message, the first 300 kings, if you looked them up from that time, for 300 years, are all buried in Glastonbury on the right-hand side of the abbey. I've been there, and it just is a grass over. But all 300 kings, very important kings, are buried there that want to rise with Mary when Christ comes back, or when the Messiah comes back.
That's so funny, isn't it? So so this king was Ethelbert, and he married Bertha, and she's the one that refused to consent to the marriage unless she gets to bring St. Augustine with her. This was all part of the plan to bring Catholicism in, but it still didn't come in for many, and we're going to get to that. So Alfred the Great was the king at the time of the Viking raids. We talked about that, and he put the law of the Bible into the Constitution in Britain. He actually just took the whole thing and just put it in there. And it's so amazing. Now, he had all kinds of issues. He was the one that kept the Vikings from coming in, but he was a huge believer. And this is some of the stuff that he pushed in. He pushed in, and you can see it in here. Captains of tens, 50s, and hundreds and 1,000 come straight from the Bible, representing the people, called the Wiccan. And then it says that the captain of 1,000 was called a sheriff. And that's what we call common law. The common law is based on the laws that Alfred the Great, who was the king that united all of England at that point. And he's the one that says, I trace my ancestry back to Joseph of Arimathea, the 10th generation. I'm the 10th generation from Joseph of Arimathea. That is amazing history. He's an amazing person. Now, he struggled all his life with epilepsy. He just struggled all his life with epilepsy. But look at all the stuff that he accomplished and this is just amazing that he pushed in the law. And that's where the common law comes from. It comes from Alfred the Great. They never called anybody else out great in Britain. They never did. He was the only one that had that title. Now, Columba, this is the story that I love. He was the one that came out of France. He went into the area of Scotland. He did just like St. Patrick's. He did the same thing St. Patrick's did, but he did it for Scotland. And he was exiled to Iona, which is an island off the coast of where a lot of people are also buried, kings that are buried there. Established a missionary school. There's a lot of history behind him. He's the one that got exiled because he went into the castle and took this book of Psalms and he wrote it all down, and then he tried to sneak it back in and they caught him. So he was exiled because you weren't allowed to touch those books. Weren't allowed because they were afraid that if you copied them, they would lose, their authenticity. So they didn't allow people to copy them, but he wanted a copy of it, his own personal copy. So he went in and copied it. And so he got exiled for that. And when he left, he took the Stone of Scots with him, and he brought it into Scotland. And so it wouldn't be long before you would have also the people that start establishing out of Ireland would start establishing rulership in Scotland. The first king was Fergus. All right, so I can go into more of his history. He has some interesting history, but that's what he basically did. Now, this is the point. We're down to around the 12th century. This is beginning to play itself out here. In Scotland, they had a king. His name was Malcolm the Great, and he married again a woman, Queen Margaret. She was a devout Catholic. These men could never learn. And she talked him into changing Saturday to Sunday. So for Scotland, that began to occur around the 10th century. But then you would have Henry II that would come in and take over Ireland, and the Irish chief said, we'll just submit to your rule. They didn't fight him, and so he took charge of the Church of Ireland and brought in a Catholic priest, and that's how they become Catholic, and they became Catholic from that point on. And so that would have been for them, that would have been almost the 12th century. So you see, our people are still keeping the Saturday Sabbath clear up to this time frame. I mean, it's just the most amazing thing. But this woman turned the king's heart, and so this is what happened. Now, tribe of Judah, like we said before, they would move in from Northern Ireland into Scotland. It says, Judah is a lion's whelp. Thou art gone, and you stoop down and couch as a lion, and an old lion shall rouse him up. And the symbol was a lion. Now, I think I'm at the end of our slides, and that is that we now move, once they stop keeping the Sabbath, and the Catholic Church is starting to roll in everywhere, except the East. The East we haven't talked about yet. The East is still solid because they're under Persian rule. Now, the Black Plague rolls in the 13th century. We're thinking 1348. That would have been the time Wycliffe began to teach in Britain. He began to teach, and he was, again, Saturday, Sabbath, keeping the holy days. See, this is where the real Protestant Reformation started, is with him in Britain, but they don't give him the credit because, he wasn't Catholic. So there was so many people dying from the Black Plague that they estimated it was over 25 million people died during that time frame. Okay, so the reason the Black Plague was so important, it happened around the 13th century, just coming out of the Dark Ages. The people were so devastated and so enamored about what was going on with the Black Plague because it was killing more than one third of Europe. At, at, this is the point between 1348 and 1352. And it would cause a huge stir among the people. And John Wycliffe was part of that because he was actually teaching the people that this was punishment from God. And interesting because they began to repent, and that would lead, this is the one event that would lead into the Protestant Reformation. This would start, this would trigger the Protestant Reformation. So this is where we're going to stop. What I wanted to cover is show you how during that period of time, how Hasatan pushed to stamp out the real Christianity, the true church. And I just wanted you to be able to see that and see that history. So we're going to stop here. Thank you for listening.